Today, the History Club was able to meet with another excellent speaker to talk about various issues related to history and social studies. Her name was Healy, and she works for Brown University's Costs of War, which really analyzes and does a lot of research on the various costs of the war on terror, Iraq, and Afghanistan. During the talk, she spends some time going over the background of their work. She talks a lot about the many costs that we don't really think about. And throughout the talk, her work provokes the question, should we really be going to war? Is it worth it when we actually get all the facts and we look at the score sheet at the end of the day? So towards the end, we were able to ask some questions, but she does get cut off due to a time constraint. The last question we asked was about sharing different resources that might be helpful for students. And she was able to answer me in an email, and I'm going to share those resources in the description. So if you're watching this, please check out Brown University's work. It's really important for students, it's really important for citizens, and we hope you enjoy the discussion.
My name's Mimi Healy. I'm a research associate with the Costs of War project. And I guess first I'll just say that the Costs of War project is housed in the Watson Institute at Brown University in Rhode Island. And it's just a small group of people who it's all female founded and created. It was created in 2011 by an anthropologist named Catherine Lutz and a political scientist named Nita Crawford, and now is co-directed by an anthropologist named Stephanie Savell. And so I guess kind of to begin, I wanted to ask because I'm assuming you all were born before 9/11. Is that correct? Were you 9/11 2001?
Uh,
Oh,
after.
sorry, after. Sorry, I meant after. Yes.
I was in third grade.
Okay. And everyone else was born after, right? So, I guess just to kind of like encroach my little presentation, if I could see like I guess like show of hands, like raise your hand, yes, if you feel like you kind of know like I know this is a history club, so like if you know the history of kind of leading up to 9/11 and the ramifications afterwards, or even like just kind of if you know what I'm assuming you all know what it is, but do you feel like you have a pretty good understanding of it or kind of here and there?
You got like it's two, but it seems like they're half agreeing.
Yeah, that's okay. So the Cost of War project was really started. It was started in 2011, but it was started, in response to the attacks on the Twin Towers in 2001 on 9/11. And so when that happened, it was obviously a huge devastation for so many people and as a country in the US. And George W. Bush declared the global war on terror. So the Costs of War project really looks at how that global war on terror, sometimes like GWAT, the ramifications of that globally and how the ramifications of the US military presence globally has affected the lives of everyone, not just our military, but people all around the world. So the project was really started to look at some of the like unacknowledged costs in the US. A lot of times the Department of Defense and US military will look at the financial costs and say like, oh, this war costs X amount to taxpayers, or this war costs X amount to X, Y, and Z. But the like human, social, environmental, political costs are not as commonly acknowledged. So that is where the Cost of War project came in. And we really said, what has been the cause of these wars? What was the intention behind going to war? And was it useful? Has it been successful? And what has really come out of that? And what does success mean when going to war? And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the basis of it. And since then, since 2011, there's been like so many kind of broad global geopolitical changes. But I'm assuming, do you all remember last year when um, the US military pulled out of Afghanistan? Okay, yeah. So a lot of the like dominant discourse in the US was, okay, well, the global war on terror has been ended in this area in Afghanistan, and this can kind of close a chapter. The Costs of War project has really illuminated how that isn't really the case, and that these repercussions and ramifications of war last, you know, decades and decades, and have lifelong impacts for the people who have experienced them. So not only veterans of the US military, but also a really big part of what the costs of war looks at is how civilians and the people living in the areas that the US has invaded are affected by the war. So um, let's see. Was thinking it could be kind of good to situate, because I know it can feel really abstract, and I know that, you know, war and the military can feel just like this huge, unbelievably powerful thing, which it's kind of nice to situate it in like some statistics, I find. So one big thing that we look at is like the costs to human lives and um, the budgetary costs. So, I guess firstly, the Department of Defense, which is, the department in the US government which like holds the military, and they release they release like financials every so often, and they have come to announce that the post 9/11 wars, which have taken place in over 85 countries. So, when we think of the post 9/11 wars, I think a lot of times, especially like, I mean, I'm 26, so I'm not that much older than everyone, but um uh but we come to like, I think a lot of the dominant narrative is like these wars have happened in like Afghanistan, Iraq, you know, Syria, Yemen, um and like a handful of other countries that really come to mind. But our research has shown that the US military has conducted counterterrorism operations in 85 countries. So that's over 40% of the countries in all of the world. Um, so in that, we've looked at a lot of different research and come to determine that the post 9/11 wars have cost $8 trillion. And the Department of Defense has said that they only cost $1 trillion. So, that's a really big kind of number to comprehend. I mean, $1 trillion would be huge on itself and on its own, but $8 trillion really, when you take into account every aspect, whether it be like long-term veteran care, fuel for planes, all of the costs from the smallest costs to the largest costs. $8 trillion is what we've come to determine is the cost of the post 9/11 wars. And so, in thinking about that, we also have looked at the human costs. Some of the biggest costs have been in direct death and direct combat. So, um, in terms of war, we think like what happens during war. There's combat, there's like training and assistance. That's a big part of the US military's um like plan when they go to a base in another country, to train local military and prepare them in their country. And so when you look at death, it's like the human impact of things it's a lot easier to look at the direct death because it's like absolutely what's directly caused from bombs, from combat, from fighting. And it's important to acknowledge that there's also a lot of indirect death. So through our research, we've found that there are almost 1 million direct deaths in the post 9/11 wars. So that's due to direct violence. But indirectly, the UN has a statistic which says that for every one direct death, there are 3 indirect deaths. So this is, if there's a drone strike to a country or to an area, and not only are 10 people killed from that direct strike, but the strike maybe takes out a hospital, and then the strike maybe damages some water lines. And then, how many people are not getting the health care and assistance that they need? How many people are without clean water? And then what ramifications does this have? So, I mean, it's impossible to put a number on the amount of indirect deaths that the US post 9/11 wars have caused. Um, and I think that's something that really is a key part of the costs of wars work, is shedding light on the fact that although there have been many direct deaths, the fact that there have been so many indirect deaths, both from, in like the veteran community in the US and in the local populations that have experienced US intervention. We have to acknowledge these things when asking, was it worth it? Is using military force the best way to go about ending conflict? And historically, there have been hundreds of examples in which we've used nonviolent tactics, in which countries have used nonviolent tactics to address conflict and geopolitical issues. And that's really a huge part of our project is, why is war always the answer? Why is military force always the go-to? And why do we keep giving money to the Pentagon, Department of Defense budget to supply weapons, and people aren't really holding the government accountable? So that's what a lot of our research does. So just to kind of give you an idea of like how the process works, because there are like think tanks which often publish research and are kind of like hubs of an expertise. There's like activist organizations, which I'm sure you're all aware of, like examples of those, but people who are really advocating for and taking action. And then, there's like government policy and congressional action, public policy that can take place in changing like laws, affecting budgets, government budgets. So how the Costs of War project works, it's kind of uniquely situated in all of those, in that we are we publish research which is fact-based and evidence-based. And so we pull like various scholars and academics to publish research. And then that research is kind of put out into the world, and we work with different like activists, advocacy organizations, to try and create change in that way. We do congressional outreach, so trying to impact the budget and different public policy around war and, indirect costs and things. And then we do a lot of media and journalist work as well. So just trying to really change the dominant narrative and to try and foster some of these conversations around, is war worth it? What has been the impact of going to war for now, 20 years, 20 plus years. And I'm sure you all know, but this is the longest US war. And the fact, I think I think it's pretty crazy that, I mean, almost myself included, but the fact that we've, as a country, have been in this war on terror since before you were born, um, is really shocking. And being a younger person myself, and talking to the scholars that we work with, who have gone through like doctorate school and PhDs, and are now either working in research or, teaching, they talk about how crazy it is to talk to their students in college who don't remember 9/11 and have been in war their whole lives. But I think that your generation and um, just younger people in general can really, like, there's like an activism that's kind of beautiful in so many young people that I've found. And I think it's a really amazing opportunity to question why you've been at war, like why the US has been at war your whole lives, and to really um, say that sentence out loud is pretty crazy, considering that is kind of all you've known. It's a hard reality, and it's a reality that I think, we need to talk about more. And I think too, being young, like, I know that when I think of like anti-war movements in the past, I think of like the Vietnam War. And I've definitely encountered people who have said like, oh well, the war movement is dead, anti-war movement is dead. There's climate change now, and there's like more movements around like social inequality and social activism, Black Lives Matter, and various things like that. But I think something that the Cost of War project does so well is shows that war is an intersectional issue, and it's really embedded within so many of these other issues. So like one of our big areas of research, and what one of the co-founders, Nita Crawford, really specializes in, is looking at the environmental costs of war. And so this has direct overlaps with like the climate change movement. And I think, like, as young people, that's something that it seems like a lot of people have gotten behind, is climate change, because we're feeling and seeing the direct impacts of that in our daily lives. But the US military is let me make sure I'm like saying this exactly right. Um, the US military is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. Um, and that's something that at least I did not know until I started working at Costs of War and doing some more research. But um, the military has huge ramifications on the climate. And um, even just not only thinking of like greenhouse gases and things, but you think, what are the impacts of like having the bombs dropped on a place, and then that's seeping into the soil, and how does that affect not only like water supply or water quality, but how does that affect the ability to grow things, how does that affect livestock and cattle. There's a lot of research recently around, one of our contributors has done research around like military burn pits, which are these huge pits of just like in the earth that, because the US war, post 9/11 wars, the war on terror, was funded through like borrowing and lending and credit card. So I guess to backtrack, previous wars have been funded through taxpayer dollars, and one of the unique things about this time period and this set of wars has been that these are like credit card wars. So we are in a deficit. And so there's defense contractors and weapons manufacturers who are profiting off of war. But so a lot of that is, they have these military burn pits. There's some in the US too. Actually, one of the largest ones is in Louisiana. but they have them in other countries as well. So it's cheaper for the military to just throw something into a burn pit. So, like a truck, for example, it's cheaper to completely burn a whole truck than like change the tire, um, because of how this war was funded. So then you have to think, have how has the pollution from this burn pit affected this local community? And there's a contributor at the Costs of War who has done research on like a lot of the birth defects that have come out of that, both in humans and in animals. Like there have been people in areas close to these burn pits that have had like cows born with two legs, or different things that affect their whole livelihoods. So the Costs of War as a project really looks at all of these impacts and really tries to like change that conversation that people are having around why go to war and really who is being impacted by this. And I think one of the things that comes out of it is like we're all impacted by this. Even if you've never had family in the military, and you've never even like maybe been directly impacted by the post 9/11 wars, like taxes are impacted by this. Social inequality has risen due to being at a 20+ year war as a country. You look at like student debt, poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, climate change. It's all unfortunately impacted by the military, and I feel like I'm really being so it's really hard to talk about. I'm sorry if this is like coming at you really fast, because it's a lot of information and it's a lot of heavy information. It's hard to hear. I know that. But I think that, well, I hope that I am sort of giving information that might be shocking and might be hard to hear. And you can use that to really like push conversation and push discussion with your peers and with people that in these industries, or even going to college. Like this might impact some of your interests in the future, because there are definitely like some of these weapon manufacturers are on college campuses recruiting people because they pay a lot and people have student debt, and sometimes it seems like the only option. But I think really holding these people accountable and holding our government accountable is so important. And there's a lot of really amazing youth movements out there that are doing that. So I hope that this has kind of inspired some interest in this topic. And I encourage you all to look at some of the Costs of Wars research and things online. But I'm happy to take any questions, or if you guys have any thoughts or want to talk about anything.
Um, with the 85 countries that the war on terror has been in, could you just like name a few of those, like the lesser, like the ones that people might not know and stuff?
Yeah, actually, I can show you a graph if can I share my screen? I think I can.
I think you can. If not, I can probably give you permission.
Okay. Let's see here. I'll pull up. There's actually a really great graph that my boss, Stephanie Savell, who's the co-director, has created. Um, so let's see. Oh, it says disabled, but that's okay. I can send it to you and I can name off some. So
Okay.
like I think a lot of them that you're thinking, just like I mentioned, like Afghanistan, Iraq, some Middle Eastern countries, right? But for instance, we have counterterrorism in US counterterrorism operations in Italy, in Spain, in Ethiopia, in um, Morocco, Libya, Bangladesh, Thailand, Indonesia, the Maldives, around many parts of the Middle East, around many parts of Africa. Um, Lebanon. There's quite a few that, like, we don't hear very much about Italy having US counterterrorism operations, but yeah, they're there. It's kind of crazy.
And the difference in like the estimated cost, like obviously the Department of Defense says that it's $1 trillion, but you guys have an estimate at 8 trillion. Do
Mhm.
you guys, is that purely like the US cost, or do you guys also estimate the costs for other countries and what it's costed them?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually do US costs. So that is 8 trillion US, um, or like the cost is the US spending $8 trillion to fund these wars. Or well, they're in debt, so they're not paying that, but it's that it does cost $8 trillion. Um, and I mean, I think that's something that would be really fascinating to look at. A lot of the research that we do is through like compiling different data sources. Like we use the DoD research, we use like looking at independent research that's been done. And we use all different sources to kind of come up with that number. So I don't know how it would be to look at other countries, but it is like appalling that it's just the US. That's $8 trillion. Yeah.
Go ahead, Will. Um, with the war in Ukraine, should I speak louder? Can you hear me fine?
Maybe.
Okay. With the war in Ukraine happening right now,
Mhm.
is it like? Do you think it's a good idea that we're like giving them money currently? Do you think we should send more money, or do you like? Is it even a good idea to give more, like within like troops, even like manpower, like actually get involved in a war?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think that's a question that doesn't have like a direct answer, unfortunately. It's one of like we have actually so the Cost of War project was always looking at the post 9/11 wars, but I'd say that the Ukraine Russia conflict is really, departing from that, and we've started to expand. But so we actually had a paper that came out about like de-escalation in Russia. And so in terms of like funding that war, it's so hard because I think there are nonviolent negotiation tactics and um like I said earlier, like things that have historically been effective in um, you know, like minimizing or lessening the conflict. But now that we've got to this point, it's just a really complex issue. I think that there's been a lot of discussion, not so much just from costs of war, but like kind of just there's been like a big public discussion around um, if it's worth continuing to like bump up the Pentagon budget and increase the Pentagon budget um in kind of like the excuse that is being used is like for Ukraine, whereas I think a lot of that is kind of like I said, like an excuse. I'm not quite sure that it's the best idea to continue just like throwing money at the Pentagon. Um, but again, it's just so hard because, like, of course, these are human lives that we're talking about, and these are people's um, like identities and lived experiences. And um, at the end of the day, it is just such a complex issue. I don't think any of us would say it's great to like spend more money towards war. Of course, the like goal is peace and no war. Um, but it's just unfortunately too complex of a situation for me to like give a quick answer on. But um, yeah.
Just a heads up, we have about 10 minutes left until it
Okay.
just totally cuts you off and hangs up.
Okay, that's fine. It's okay.
Do you guys have estimates on like say how long it will take a country to kind of come back from the cost of war? Because obviously I think a lot of these countries that we see it in, or that we're focused on like Middle East, they don't have as much, I guess, financial freedom as the US to really
Mhm.
analyze certain areas, like agriculturally and everything. Do you guys have estimates on how long we would even still be in those areas, or how long it would kind of take to recover from a war like that, both for the U.S. and the potential?
That's a good question. We don't have estimates on that, in, you know, in like concrete terms of saying like it will take X amount of years, but um, I think, I guess, in kind of taking a lot of the different research, we can kind of look at different factors that might assist in like building more infrastructure for that country, or like how, um, I guess, looking at like how badly the devastation is and like taking different estimates, but we don't have direct like numbers on that. I will say that we do have like some of the kind of numbers that I didn't really even mention. We have numbers on displacement, which is kind of to your point, like in war, we have, our estimate is that there's over 38 million people displaced in the post 9/11 wars. But it could be as high as like 49 to 60 million. So in looking at that, I mean, it's the same situation as in Ukraine. Like we've seen so much news coverage of people fleeing Ukraine. And so it's kind of like, it's like, can a country get back to how it was before? I think is really like the question. And that's really like kind of what this project asks is like, if 38 million people are displaced, is it possible for them to move back and resume the life that they had before war? And that's kind of like the thing that has to be discussed more, is like, we like, war has these like just lifelong impacts. Like if you're displaced as a 15-year-old, out of your home and have to flee, like not only are you going to be like physically displaced, but like what trauma has that caused? How does that affect your family's finances? How does it affect your ability to get an education? How does that affect, like your food security and home security and shelter? And it just completely like upends people's lives. So it's a hard question to ask, and I don't know if there even is like an answer, like a direct answer, like, oh, it might take 15 years. But I think in terms of like infrastructurally, there's probably some data out there around like, oh, it takes X amount of money to build a hospital. And once you had that money, contractors in that country, or like, builders in that country could build it in like 2 years or something. But I mean, your question is really like illuminative to kind of asking like, is it possible to get back to how you were before war, and looking at all the impacts that it has on someone's life.
Anybody else? What do we have time? We got 6 minutes. If they don't have questions, I definitely do.
Yeah.
Probably have too many. So I wanted to know first, I'll start off with softballs. What was one of the findings that surprised you?
I think probably one of the biggest findings, let me think. We recently published like a graph that, like a chart that compares pre-2011, during the US invasion, and then 2022 in Afghanistan, and looked at like different determinants of kind of well-being and health. And I'm from North Carolina. I grew up near Fort Bragg. Like I was born in Fayetteville, so it's a huge military base. So I grew up around tons of people who were in the military or had friends whose parents were in the military, and was always kind of given this narrative that like, we're helping, like it's good that we're there, we're making the country better. And the graph that we published shows that like pre 2001, during and after, there has not been like a continuum of advancement as you'd think. Like, you know, social advancement hasn't gone up, like health, security and well-being hasn't improved as much as you would think, if at all. A lot of them have actually like gone down, which I was really, I mean, now I'm not shocked to find out now that I've like learned so much, but initially I was really surprised by that.
With all the work you guys do, which is extremely important, and hopefully policymakers check it out. I'd imagine, especially with, as you said, like the way you grew up and everyone around you, they had certain beliefs. I imagine that you have to get like pushback. What has that been like, if you've received it?
Yeah, no, we've received it. Um, uh, well, especially around like our more recent paper on Ukraine, it's kind of, like I said, like it's just been a tricky topic to discuss, because it's so contentious and such a terrible thing that's happened. But I think, you know, there's like an assumption sometimes that if you're anti-war or like critical of the military, that you're not patriotic, and this like idea of freedom and this idea of like war as a force of good. And if you're against that, there's a lot of pushback on like, well, you hate your country, or um things like that, I guess. But I think that like we take the opposite view, and we think like all lives, you know, are important to look at, not just like US lives, but looking at the global picture of war. And also, you know, one of the statistics that I think, this is actually the one that surprised me most, um, of the amount of people who've died in combat, US military members who have died in combat, 4 times as many have committed suicide. Um, so that really just speaks to like the ramifications of war, like post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever else you have after, you know, coming back from uh the US military and from fighting in a war. So I mean, we you know, get pushback about that kind of stuff all the time, but we look at like both US and abroad implications of war.
All right, a minute and 40 seconds.
I'll be quick.
Your advice for history students.
um I'd say look at as much of like the holistic picture as you can, and um try and examine things not just from like a US centric maybe point of view, but try and take like a more, well, not take a more, but like just be aware of what perspective people are telling history from, because I think it's important to have a holistic view of things, and not only having like one positionality or one viewpoint, but really taking into account how the telling of history can really impact like conversation and dominant public discourse and belief systems and things like that.